There are a few names I see on the participant list that I know from past opportunities. During my time, I want to simply speak on a number of the insect pests that we see. There are many of them, and today I will give an overview of a number of them that I know that you face in your locations, and hopefully in the future then at an in-person conference we can discuss some of these in more detail. One thing that I would like to do really today is just focus on what's highlighted in yellow here, and that's understanding the systems of the pests that we're talking about. Because when you have a basic understanding of the biology of the pest, without exception, you can always do a better job of managing them. And when I look at reasons, how we evaluate various pests, here, okay. One of the things that we sometimes don't understand well is the life cycle. In this particular graph, this would be for obviously the northern hemisphere. The tall bars represent the highest insect populations, and the white line represents when the turf damage would appear. And often the case is that the damage actually appears after the peak insect population. So that's part of the reason why I talk about the biology of the pest, so you understand its life cycle. And you can prevent the damage from increasing because you understand the life cycle and when the optimal time to control the pest might be. And I get a lot of questions every year on why a product would fail, why a pesticide didn't work. And there's a lot of reasons, but the two at the bottom are the most common one. And the last one is that it's just difficult environmental conditions. It may be very hot and dry, and the insecticide just doesn't work very well. Or it may be that there's an error in the timing, and that is the most common one, in that we have products that work very well, but we simply don't time it really well. And as a result, the product doesn't work as well as we would like. So I'm going to start out and talk about a number of pests. Some of them, you see in your area, some of them you may not, and we'll cover a number of them. But one is what we call the fall armyworm. And armyworms are a pest in the Western Hemisphere. Then in North America, South America, Central America, it's a native species, and we see a lot of it. It's the adult is a moth, and that adult lays eggs. And from those eggs, the small caterpillars will hatch in a matter of just a few days. So here's the life cycle. You have the adult moth. It lays eggs on a variety of surfaces, and then when the eggs hatch, they hatch into small larvae or caterpillars. And then as they continue to feed and grow over the next 3 or 4 weeks, they get much larger. Then eventually, when they're fully grown, they bury in the soil and they form a pupa, it's called. And that's the transition stage to become an adult moth again. And this cycle can repeat itself multiple times during the year, but it always goes through this cycle. And this is what an egg mass looks like. The female moth will lay a number of eggs in a group or a cluster, and they'll lay these eggs on trees, on buildings, on fences, on a lot of different surfaces, and not really on the turf grass itself. And here you see on a golf course a wooden post, and you can see that it's just covered with egg masses. And here in the United States this year has been probably the worst year we have ever seen for fall armyworms. So some of these photos are ones from just in the last couple of months. And here you even see on a golf course on the flag these egg masses. So it's very, very common to see their eggs on things that other than the turf grass. In fact, they rarely will they ever lay an egg on the turf grass. And these are what the worms look like. You give you an idea. My hand, when they get this large, there's two things that are very, very important. One is that they eat a lot when they're large. They will eat a great amount of turf or foliage. And the other one is when they get large like this, they're more difficult to control. And we'll talk about that in just a few minutes, the challenge that that presents. These are what we call the pupa. This is when the caterpillar is fully grown and it buries itself in the soil, they convert to this pupa. They stay there for about 5 to 7 days, and then they eventually emerge as a moth again, and the whole process starts all over again. Um, this insect cannot tolerate cold temperatures. It's a very tropical insect. In most areas, it has to migrate, the moths migrate or they fly after the winter time is over. In the United States, they only survive in the very southern portion of Texas, in the very southern portion of Florida. And then in the springtime, they migrate northward and they cause the infestations. But even in this pupal cage in the soil and stage in the soil, they cannot survive cold temperatures. So really anything below 0 degrees Celsius, this insect cannot survive. And I show this photo because it represents the characteristic that the moths have of laying their eggs on structures or plants other than the turf grass. Here, the moths laid their eggs on the sides of this house, and then when they hatched, the small caterpillars crawled down the side of the house. They began to feed on the turf grass, and then as they became larger, they began to actually damage the turf grass, and they began to spread out. They're called armyworms because they essentially march. They walk further away from where they first hatched, and they do this significant amount of damage. Here's just another example, and you can see that the fall armyworm moths laid their eggs on either the landscape plants or on the side of the building. And then once they hatched, they moved into the turf grass, and then they moved across the turf grass, and eventually their damage was stopped simply because of the sidewalk that prevented them from feeding on any more turf grass. But this is really a very common characteristic of armyworms in that they move outward from the area where they laid their eggs. And how this is important is that armyworms rarely occur in the middle of a turf area. They occur from the sides or the edges, and they move in. So there are several valuable points from this, and one is that if you think you see fall armyworms, the place to look is along the edge of the turf grass area, along the edge of the sports turf, along the edge of the golf course, or the edge of whatever turf property it might be, because that's where they're going to start and they're going to move inward. It's also important because if you find them early, you probably only need to treat the perimeter or the edge of the turf area, because that's where all the worms are concentrated at first, and then they obviously disperse or spread out as the infestation continues. So this idea that they lay their eggs on buildings and plants and fences and irrigation valve boxes and all kinds of things like that tells us where the problem is going to originate, and that's really important for us to know. This just shows example. This is Bermuda grass, and it shows you the extent of damage that these insects can do. It can be quite significant. It can happen very, very quickly once they get large and they begin to move. So it's a challenge for us to manage these in an effective way. But the fact that they always start along the edge or side of the property and move in does help us a little bit. And they really like newly sodded areas, newly sprigged areas, and newly seeded areas. And part of it is we're putting a lot of water on it. We're getting new, young growth of the turf grass, and it's really desirable. And this is a case where, again, sod was put down, a lot of water was applied to keep it alive, a lot of fertilizer to green it up, and the fall armyworms found it and began to move in and do a lot of damage in a very short period of time. One way that you can detect armyworms early. The first one on the left is if you see a lot of birds. Birds love armyworms. They will find an infestation when it's along the edge, and they will have a banquet or a feast feeding on these armyworms. Unfortunately, they typically don't feed enough to actually control the population, but they can certainly be an early indicator that you have a problem. So if you see a lot of birds in the property of turf grass, you may want to go out and check. And one of the easiest ways to check is to mix up some soapy water. Just take some liquid dishwashing detergent and add about 15 mils of this detergent, the liquid detergent, per liter of water. And in the area where you suspect fall armyworms, where there's either damage or where you saw a lot of birds, you pour that out. And you would pour about 4 liters over, say, a square meter area. You pour that out because they're not all during the day, especially they're not up on top of the turf feeding. They're down deeper in the turf. So if you pour about 4 liters of this solution over a square meter area, you get down on your hands and knees and you look. If you have fall armyworms, they will move to the top of the turf grass because they do not like the soapy water. So it's an accurate method to determine, do I really have fall armyworms and do I need to do something about it? So keep that in mind. We'll talk about it again in just a little bit when we talk briefly about mole crickets. So there are a number of products that can be used to help you. Some of the products that have been around for a long time, such called the pyrethroids, and I have some trade names here from the US, but lambda cyhalothrin, bifenthrin, deltamethrin. These are very common. They've been around for many, many years. And they're typically people like to use them because they're not very expensive. So they're a good choice as far as the cost. They do not work quite as well against very large caterpillars. They'll still control 70%, but they probably won't control 95% if the caterpillars are very large. They also have very little residual activity. In other words, you spray them and the pyrethroids are probably not going to work after they've been out for 7 days or so. We had old chemistries such as chlorpyrifos and acephate. These work very well against armyworms. And then we have some newer chemistries that may or may not be available for you. One that Syngenta has called acetylene chlorantraniliprole, and another one that Syngenta has, trade name in the States is Provant or Indoxacarb. These work very, very well. They're going to be a lot more expensive, but they work very well against fall armyworms. Chlorantraniliprole gives months and months of residual long-term control. There's also a new one from Bayer. I failed to add to this slide. It is tetraniliprole, and in the States, it is the trade name is Tetrino, Tetrino. It also is very, very effective. So you have a lot of options. There's a lot of difference in the price or the cost of these products, but there are a lot of options to look at for fall armyworm control. The key is watching for birds, watching for damage along the edge, and trying to do your control or start your control relatively soon. Now I want to talk about what we often refer to as simply white grubs. There are a number of species. It's a frequent problem. In some cases, it's a sporadic problem, but it is a frequent problem in many turf areas, especially turf that is irrigated. These are the larval stage or the immature stage of beetles. This is a very common shape. They take on what we call a C shape. They will be, the life cycle is that the insect spends 80% or more of its life in this grub stage, a very short period of time as an adult, very short period of time as eggs, and a very short period of time as a pupa. This has a life cycle very much like the fall armyworm we talked about. There are a lot of species. These are just some of the examples that we have in the States. Uh, you have the beetle. The beetle lays its eggs in the soil. For most of the species we have, this happens in the middle of the summer. Then those eggs hatch into grubs or larvae. There are typically three stages. There's a very small stage, a medium stage, and they complete these two stages usually within about 3 weeks. Then they become the full-size grub, and they begin feeding on the roots of the turf grass, doing a lot of damage. They typically will overwinter in this stage, and then the following spring, they will form the pupa, which is the picture on the top right, and they'll stay in that stage for a couple of weeks, and then they'll emerge as a beetle. Most of the time, we have one generation per year for most species. There are some exceptions, and there certainly are some exceptions in the southern hemisphere. So the challenge with this particular insect is that they feed directly on the roots of the turf grass. So they can create drought stress, they can reduce nutrient uptake, and just reduce overall turf health. They move up and down somewhat based on the soil moisture. The more soil moisture you have, the closer they will be to the surface. And when it gets very dry, they will be down deeper in the soil because they do need good soil moisture. The other thing about them feeding on the roots that makes them a challenge is you typically don't know you have them because they're hidden from us to see and observe them. So they can be causing damage, and we may not even see that. The populations can be quite high. We sometimes get a variety of creatures that come in and will destroy the turf looking for the grubs to eat. They're a preferred food source for a lot of animals, for us, raccoons, skunks, armadillos, even wild pigs such as javelinas, oftentimes will tear up the turf grass so that they can find these grubs and eat them. So that's a second level of damage that they cause, is they attract animals that will feed on them. So again, just a quick review. We have the four stages, just like we do for the armyworm: the adult stage, the egg stage, the larval stage, which is the damaging stage, and it's also how this insect lives most of its life, then the pupae. So this is an example of a life cycle in the U.S., and this is really consistent in many parts of the U.S. I realized we would have to flip the seasons, and we'd need to start with on the left-hand side with July rather than January to match up with your seasons. But in the middle of the summer, typically we get the beetle. The beetle may feed on trees or plants of other kinds of plants. It will lay eggs in the soil. Then those eggs will hatch out sometime in the middle of the summer. You'll have the initial small grub. It will develop into the medium-sized grub, the second stage, and then eventually into a larger grub. Now, depending upon how cold your winters are, the grub may go deep in the soil for several months, or it may just kind of slow down feeding for a very short period of time if your winters aren't cold. But they overwinter typically as this grub stage. And then in the spring, when things warm back up, they will feed for a while, then they form the pupa, and then eventually in the early summer, they'll emerge as the beetle again to start the whole process over. Again, for many of the species of larger white grubs that we have, they have one generation per year. Unlike the fall armyworm that has multiple generations, it can have a generation every month. This insect, usually it's once a year. For some of them, it takes more than 1 year to complete a life cycle. And there are a very few species that actually have multiple generations in a year. There are a number of products that some of you are familiar with. One of the most popular historically has been imidacloprid. It's been around for 25 years or so, and has worked very well. And continues to work well after all these years. There are some other products, clothianidin, thiamethoxam, and then a combination product, clothianidin plus bifenthrin. And then the chlorantraniliprole product that I mentioned is also very good. And Bayer has just, as I mentioned on the fall armyworms, released a product, tetraniliprole, which again, I don't know the trade name in South America, but it is Tetrino in North America. These products all work very, very well. They work really well with a caveat, with one little bit of information you've got to have. They need to be applied when either when the eggs are being laid or when the grubs are small. And if I back it up to this slide, so in the US, in the area where I'm from, if you're applying the end of June, early July, you're going to get excellent control. If you would apply, and again, this will be, December, January, or for you. If you're applying in September, October, which would be equivalent of applying in April and May or so for you, or March, April, May, when the grubs are big, these products are not going to work as well. So you've really got to know the life cycle of your pest. And if you're consistently finding big grubs, large white grubs, you need to go out next year and start looking earlier and see if you can find them when they're small, because that's the time when you need to have these products out. And if you can apply them at the time when you see the beetles, when the beetles are laying eggs, you will get excellent control from these products. They are really very, very good. There are some traditional products that have been around for a long time. Trichlorphon is one of them. It's one that can be used when you find larger grubs. It's very water soluble. It doesn't have any residual activity, but it's very water soluble and can work very quickly. So it's a valuable product. There are other products that contain active ingredients of bendialcarb or isofenphos. These also can work really well against larger grubs in case you miss it. And then finally, diazinon. I don't know, again, the availability of these, but these are products that have been around for a long time. And if you can get them, diazinon, bendialcarb, and isofenphos can also be applied in the middle of the summer for control. Trichlorphon would only be used later in the year against larger grubs because it really doesn't last very long in the soil, only a few days. It's very important when you treat for white grubs that you either do it before an expected rain or you irrigate or water it in immediately, because that's so very important. In order to get good control, you've got to move the product down into the soil. When you irrigate, the grubs will get a little bit closer to the surface. You're moving the insecticide down into the soil. And you also avoid leaving the insecticide on the surface where sunlight will break it down and those things. So it's really important for the best control to irrigate as soon as possible. So I want to talk a little bit about what we call bill bugs. They've become a problem in North and South America more and more in recent years. They're somewhat similar to the white grubs, but these do have multiple generations a year, and they differ in their biology or their life cycles, whether they're in warm season turf grass or cool season turf grass. So it's one that we have to study and understand very, very carefully, and that in your location, you may actually have to do some research to figure out what their life cycle looks like. So this is the adult. It's a type of weevil or a beetle. They have a life cycle that's the same. They lay eggs, it hatches into a grub, then it forms a pupa, then eventually emerges as a beetle again. These are very active at night. You typically will not see these beetles during the day, but at night, if you went out with a flashlight, you might well see them, and that's one way that you can check for them. This is what we typically see in damage from them. Now, this is a warm season turf. This is a Bermuda grass, but the damage often looks the same. It's oftentimes not really large areas, and it's in kind of irregular shape patches or areas. And on the lower left, you see the beetle, and on the lower right, you see the grub. The grubs are not very large, maybe 6 millimeters long or so. They have no legs, which makes them different from the bigger white grubs that we saw earlier. So it's a very, very common pests that we run into, but we oftentimes never diagnose them because we don't see that many of the larvae, and we aren't out at night, so we don't see the adults either. Typically, the larvae feed right at the base of the plant, so you can see how they would be very destructive. They simply can cut the plant off at the ground. Many times in the damaged turf, you can grab a hold of it and pull it up, and it will just come loose from the soil because it's not really attached anymore. So it can be a very damaging problem, uh, particularly in cool season turf. In warm season turf, we believe that the adults are equally as damaging, that they feed very aggressively in the crown of the plant or the base of the plant. And so that's why I say whether you have cool season turf or warm season turf, the damage it seems to be different. Like I say, the cool season turf, we find the larvae right at the base of the plant feeding very aggressively, and in warm season turf, we find the adults feeding very aggressively and causing the damage. So what we found in the southeastern portion of the United States, and I realize your seasons are flipped from ours. We find in the spring we get a lot of adult activity, and again in the fall we get a lot of adult activity. So there are two approaches. One would be, if you want to control the larvae, you would want to control them when the eggs are being laid and when the grubs are hatching, just like the white grubs we talked about earlier. So in this case, in North Carolina, where I'm from, it would be you would treat in May or early June, or you would treat in October or early November. One of the other things that we have found by monitoring the populations of the adults is that we can actually control them very easily using inexpensive pyrethroid insecticides. So by controlling the adults, you prevent the laying of eggs. In warm season turf, we prevent the damage from laying of eggs, and we prevent the damage from the adults feeding, and we prevent the eggs from being laid. In cool season turf, we just simply prevent the eggs from being laid, so then we don't have the larvae feeding on the base of the plant. And this is just an example where we had damage from it. You can see the irregular shaped patches. And when we went and controlled the adults the next year, and the picture on the right, you can see that it had a very significant impact on the turf quality. The insecticides that you would use are the same ones, the pyrethroids, the same ones that we recommended for the fall armyworms, lambda-cyhalothrin, diltimethren, bifenthrin. When you see that they're active, you can control them. For controlling the larvae, it would be exactly the same ones that I showed earlier for the control of white grubs, such as imidacloprid and those products. They work very well, but you have to have the timing correct, and that's going to vary a lot with the audience that's on today in the various countries. So we really don't have a good way to monitor the adults. The best technique we have found is to go out at night with a flashlight and look for them. And when you see a lot of activity, you can either treat to control the adults, or you can treat to prevent the infestation of grubs. But this has been a challenge for us. We're continuing to learn more, and hopefully we'll continue to get better at it. I want to talk briefly about various beetles. This is something that we've not worked with a lot in the States because we haven't had significant of problems. But more recently, one that we call the sugarcane beetle. It's, as best I understand it, it's a native to the country of Brazil, has caused a lot of damage for us. And we've learned more about it, and we've learned what to do about it, and we've gotten better at it. And this is the example. And I think for many of you, you have types of beetles that are very similar, and they create holes in the turf. They damage the turf. Their life cycle may not be well understood. Many times these are attracted to lights, and you'll just see lots and lots of them in the morning that came to were attracted to the lights outside of a facility, a maintenance building, outside of a home, whatever. And then many of them are dead in the morning. So it's a problem that, while not always widespread, it's for those that have it, it's very problematic. This is an area on North Carolina State's campus that was heavily damaged by these sugarcane beetles. And if you look at the very top of the picture, you see a pole, a light pole going up. That's indeed what it was. It was a light, and it attracted the beetles at night. They dug holes in the turf, they damaged the turf, and they were very problematic. Well, we again had to monitor these. We had to determine when the life cycle was, and we found out that these beetles were very active in North Carolina in the month of April. And we were able to go after them with pyrethroid insecticides again, bifenthrin, lambda-cyhalothrin, and products like those, deltamethrin again. And they worked very well controlling these adults. And that's how we managed them rather than trying to control the grub stage, because we could do it exactly when the beetles were present, and we could do it much more inexpensively. So it does work. They're more difficult to monitor. They're sort of like the bill bugs, but they can be controlled. Now I'm going to spend just a few minutes on actually what is my favorite insect. And I know that for some of you, you don't run into these very often. I know that people here from Argentina do see them, but I just want to talk because these are really difficult to control. They can do a lot of damage, and we need to understand again the life cycle. And even if you don't ever see mole crickets in your turf grass, and I hope you don't, understanding the importance of knowing the biology of this pest and how that makes a significant difference in how much money you spend trying to control it and in how well you control it applies to all the other pests. And it goes back to that first or second slide I showed, understanding the systems of the pest. And if you understand the life cycle, you can control it better, and you can control it with spending less money. So this is a perfect example of that. I like to show this slide because for my friends that have experienced this pest, you know it can be very, very damaging. It's like white grubs, and it lives in the soil. So oftentimes when it's small, it can go about doing its some small amounts of damage and developing and growing, and you don't even notice it. And then when it gets large, it does a lot of damage and is harder to control. This one has a different kind of life cycle from all the other ones we've talked about so far. This one lays eggs just like the others, but then when the eggs hatch out, they hatch out into basically a miniature or small version of an adult mole cricket. They just don't have wings. So they're smaller, but they look exactly alike. And then as they grow, they get obviously larger, and then they develop wings. So this life cycle only has 3 stages: the adult, the eggs, and what we call the nymph. For those of you in the Southern Hemisphere, this is going to be an approximate life cycle. At this time of year, it's your spring, and you're probably seeing the adults begin to fly, just like the beetles fly or the moths fly. The same thing. They lay eggs, and then the eggs start to hatch. And at the beginning of your summer, the small mole crickets really don't cause any damage. But because they're small, they'd be very easy to control if you could detect them then and knew where they were. And then as we get further into the spring, towards the summer, the mole crickets get very large. They do a lot of damage, and they're very, very difficult to control at that stage. So again, this is why understanding the biology in your area is so important, because this insect, until it gets large and does a lot of damage, remains hidden and typically undetected. And when they get large, you're dealing with a lot of damage, and it's much more difficult to control, and you end up spending a lot more money. And this goes back to what I talked about for fall armyworms. You can detect it using the soapy water. The same liquid dishwashing detergent in about 15 mils of dishwashing detergent in a liter. and then you pour it out over about a square meter area, and you get down on your hands and knees and you watch for the crickets to come up. The optimal time to do this would be early summer when the crickets are just hatching, and you can detect when the eggs are hatching, and that is the optimal time to begin your treatments because the small crickets are really easy to control. And when they come to the surface, they oftentimes die or they don't move. So you've really got to watch carefully. The same thing's true for fall armyworms. You've got to watch carefully to make sure you detect them, especially if the turf is very lush and very thick. So I just want to give you an example of how the timing is so critically important. Here we have, I'm comparing our dates when I put these trials out in June 1st, June 20th, July 10th, and August 1st, and about when that would correlate to your time of year in the Southern Hemisphere. And you can see when the treatment went out early at the top, the control was very good, 85%. Then as we moved down and went with our June 20th treatment, the mole crickets were getting a little bit larger and the control dropped off to 75%. When we waited till July 10th, they were medium sized and the control dropped off to 45%. And then by the time we waited till the 1st of August, the crickets were quite large and we only controlled 30% of them. So this is why, it's not because the product's not any good. It's because when the crickets get large, they really are difficult to control. So again, understanding the life cycle, being able to monitor that using a soapy flush to know when the eggs are hatching can help you really do a good job of control. We do have some really good products once they get large. Products like Indoxacarb is a really good one. I don't know about its availability, but we found that it works really well as you compare the green bar to the blue one here, that it really does a good job even late in the year. These treatments were put out in August against very, very large mole crickets. So, what are the things you need to do to really control mole crickets well? If you wait until you see a lot of damage, it's going to cost you a lot. The damage has already occurred. When the crickets get large, they can actually avoid the insecticide. They'll simply go down deep in the soil for a couple of weeks, wait for the insecticide to break down or degrade, and then they'll come back up. So when they get very large, they're really, really difficult to control. And so, you want to do the best job. You want to keep the cost to a minimum. You really want to take advantage of the timing and control them when they're small. And there are a lot of good products. Fipronil is still the best product we have. But products like Indoxacarb, imidacloprid, these can be used at egg hatch, at egg laying, at egg hatch, and they will also work very well. Other products like bifenthrin or lambda-cyhalothrin or acephate, these just don't have any residual activity. You'll kill a few of the crickets when they're small, but they don't last very long. And so they would not be my preferred options when you're trying to control them early. Older products, and I don't know about the availability, but products like ethoprop, diazinon, these are old organophosphate chemistries that still work very, very well and are very effective against controlling mole crickets. Now, just finishing up here, one that we're seeing a lot more of here in where I'm at, in mites. They're very small. You get these small areas usually of infestation, and they're very difficult to control. And there's mites of Bermuda grass, there's mites of zoysia grass, mites of several species of turf grass, and there aren't a lot of good chemistries to control them. Typically, we don't even notice them until they've damaged the turf grass. Usually, they're more severe during hot and dry weather. In Bermuda grass, this is a typical. The plant on the left is healthy. The plant on the right has these shortened internodes, and it provides this appearance of like a clump or even like a broom. That's very typical of mite control. So if you see an area where there are mites, the texture of the turf just looks different, looks very different. They're almost microscopic. You're not going to see them very easily. You have to have typically some sort of a small magnifying glass or a microscope to see them. So they're very, very difficult. What we have found in the last few years as we've fought these more and more is that products that contain the active ingredient abamectin work very well. This is typically available as an egg formulation. It works very well against these mites, especially the ones in warm season turfgrass. And that has been our experience. And, we don't see a lot of other options. We know that you can do cultural practices, especially in warm season turf, where you can cut the turf very short. You can water it a lot. You can irrigate it or fertilize it a lot to get it to outgrow the damage. But that's a cultural practice that helps, but it doesn't eliminate them. And chemical control, if you still have available in your country a chemical called dicafol, the active ingredient. Kelthane was the trade name in the States. It also works very well, but they're really, my experience in the products available, there really are very few. And the abamectin product that contains abamectin is one that has proven itself very, very effective for mite control in a lot of situations and in all turf types. All right, so finishing up here, these I hope are the points that I got across as we talked about these insects. The first is you really want to treat the insects when it's most vulnerable. When it's the easiest to kill. For many reasons, you can get the highest level of control, so you don't have to go back in and treat a second or a third time. You perhaps can use a lower rate because you're catching them when they're very vulnerable. So it can be a cost-saving effort. You really need to go out and monitor to know that the insects are present. About the third slide I showed was the one of the graph that a lot of times the damage shows up after the insects have kind of already developed and they may not even be present. So make sure they're there. Make sure you have a way to monitor them to know the life stage so you can treat when they're small and get the most performance out of your insecticide. Also, make sure you properly identify the insect. This is more of a common of a problem that I hear about, where someone thought they had this insect and they treated with a product that really wasn't effective against the one that they wanted. Understand the factors that influence the insect's development. If you've got a very warm spring, the insect may show up earlier. If you've got a wet spring, in the case of like white grubs and mole crickets, many times the insect will show up earlier. So understand the conditions and what that might mean for insects and their control and their development as this time of year that they might show up. And also look at the impact of environmental conditions. When it's very hot and dry, it's hard to get insecticides to perform well, especially against insects in the soil. Oftentimes the insecticides will get tied up or bound to the soil particles or to the thatch, and they'll never make it to where the insects are. So those are all very, very important considerations. And if you can increase your understanding of the pest, monitor it well, I assure you that we have chemicals that can work very, very well today. So it's a matter of basically you doing your research to make sure that you know exactly what insect you're working with, what its life cycle looks like, and when it occurs in your area, and then responding at the right time with the proper product. Again, the slide I showed early, the main reason when I get people calling me about why an insecticide didn't work, 90% of the time is because they didn't put it out at the right time. They put it out late. They put it out late after the insects were already large, and it was just very difficult to control them. Okay, just finishing up. I know John mentioned my Facebook page. If any of you have questions, I don't mind trying to answer. I'm not going to give you my mobile phone number, but if you ever want to email with questions, you can certainly feel free to do so. There you can see my email contact information, and it's rick_at ncsu.edu. I also have a Facebook page. We've had it for over 10 years now. It is called Turf Bugs and Rock and Roll, and that rock and roll came from the fact that when we first started, my youngest son, would always play a guitar solo to begin it. But I post on this literally 5 days out of the week, Monday through Friday, with information about new products, new pests, information on those pests, that sort of thing. And then 1 day a week, I also will have a video that we talk about some particular topic. In the past couple months in North Carolina and the U.S., it's been all about fall armyworms because they've been a real serious problem. So if you are on Facebook and you want to become a member, just all you have to do is type in Turf Bugs and Rock and Roll in the search box, and just then request membership, and I will gladly make you a member and be happy for you to join the group. I think we've got about 2,500 members right now. If you want more information, I don't know if any of the other speakers will present this, but at North Carolina State University, we have a website called Turf Files. So the site here, the URL is turffiles.ncsu.edu. And we have lots of information there about various publications that are, you can access them online. Lots of new information, updates about what's going on, updates about what you ought to be doing agronomically and those sorts of things. I just put a warning on there, use with caution. And the reason for that is, obviously we're in two different hemispheres, so things are 6 months off in many cases, but also to be really good at turf management, you need to make your management specific to your location. And there's a lot of good information on the Turf Files site. But before you take it and just say, oh, that sounds good, I'm going to try it on a small scale. Try it in some small areas and really test it and evaluate it to see that this is exactly what you want, exactly what you need, and if it's really going to provide the benefits in Peru or Chile or Argentina that it does, say, in North Carolina. So I always caution, even when I'm talking to exclusively a U.S. audience, I caution them to move forward slowly when they're taking information from a different area, because turf grass is very unique in the environment and the soils it grows in, as are the pest problems. They're very specific to that particular location. So hope you can access this. Hope you can find some useful information. And for today, I think that was all the information I had. I realize it was a very quick overview. And we didn't get into a lot of specifics, but hopefully we'll have the opportunities to have this conference again, and perhaps we can have it in person. And if there are particular topics that you would like to see talked about or discussed in more detail, please provide that feedback either through the contact information that I provided or through John or whomever, so that in the future we can make the talks more focused on specific areas that you would like to hear more about. So with that, John, I'm willing to answer any questions that anyone might have.